Hello and welcome. This presentation will supplement your textbook material on selecting the right decision-making criteria. As your textbook makes clear, criteria are the standards by which alternatives may be evaluated and compared. Clearly, we use criteria every day to decide where to shop, who to call in for an interview, what to eat. But usually, our criteria are implicit. We don't explicitly articulate them. A principle of good thinking is to make your criteria explicit. Your textbook suggests that one way to do this is to ask the questions, will it or does it? So for example, in the case of a job candidate, you might ask, does the candidate possess the necessary project management experience? Or will the candidate be able to handle the pressure? Making project management experience and ability to work under pressure your criteria. There are 3 requirements for decision-making criteria. Number 1, differentiate between screening criteria and decision-making criteria, where screening criteria are those that you use to screen options out before you get to the decision-making process. Screening criteria are non-negotiable and should not be included in your decision matrix. For example, if a job requires a bachelor's degree, you would not list bachelor's degree as a criterion in your matrix because anyone who made it to the decision-making point would have already met this criterion. Deciding which are screening and which are decision-making criteria is not always clear-cut. For example, imagine you are solving a problem for a client who has a very limited budget. Should you screen out any solutions that would incur significant expenses? Or should you entertain even more costly solutions but include in your proposal how you will acquire the resources? You could go either way. The point is that you will need to make a conscious decision around whether or not low cost is a screening criterion or not, and you should not include screening criteria in your matrix. If you are truly making a decision between viable options, then nothing that hasn't made it past the screening criteria should be considered an option in the first place. Requirement number 2. Ensure criteria are distinct from each other, since overlap will cause errors in weighting. This seems obvious, but it happens amazingly often that problem solvers will use overlapping criteria. For example, someone might use the criterion affordability and not resource heavy, where both point to an option's affordability. Often when people use overlapping criteria, they simply aren't being precise enough in their language. So in this example, the person might mean low startup costs instead of affordability, and will not require additional staff instead of not resource heavy. It will be important for this class, particularly because you are working in a team, so need to communicate with clarity to each other to use precise language. Requirement number 3. Ensure criteria authentically represent your rationale. Again, this seems obvious, but it frequently happens that we say we are using certain criteria, and yet when we analyze our own recommendations, we realize that we have actually used others. To return to the hiring example, we might say we are hiring for project management experience, but not fully articulate criteria that we are really looking for example, cultural fit. A simple example. If you say that you shop locally, but you always go to Walmart, your true criterion is cost savings. Here's an example from a former learner group, where learners were making recommendations around how to reduce the number of single occupancy vehicles coming to the Royal Roads campus. Many students proposed new carpool systems, and what they claimed was that their criteria were things like cost and feasibility. What became apparent, however, as they explained their solutions was that learners actually believed that carpooling needed to be more flexible and were designing solutions around the criterion of flexibility. They just weren't articulating this. How many criteria should you use? There's no magic number, but I am recommending 3 to 5 for 2 reasons. 1, You should be able to clearly and concisely explain how you came to your decision. And you can't do that when you have too many criteria. 2, having more than 5 criteria is appropriate only in highly precise situations where you can actually measure each to a fairly granular degree. In most case analysis situations, you are working with estimates. Using too many criteria provides a false sense of precision. It might also tempt you into avoiding the really difficult questions around deciding what's truly important. How do you generate the right criteria? I would echo the textbook's recommendation that you diverge and then converge. Generating criteria is usually more difficult than it first appears, and it often takes several iterations of tweaking before you figure out what precisely you believe is important. It's recommended that you test your criteria using your matrix. If your matrix is telling you something that seems wrong to you, go back and question whether you need to adjust your criteria. That said, as we'll discuss in the presentation on matrices, you should not adjust indefinitely, since ultimately you do not want to weight your matrix so it tells you only what you want to hear. In testing your criteria in your matrix, you are testing your instrument to ensure its reliability. Once you're fairly certain it's reliable, you need to use it and listen to it. In conclusion, please keep in mind 3 points. 1. Differentiate between screening criteria and decision-making criteria. Screening criteria should not be in your matrix. 2. Ensure criteria are distinct from each other, since overlap will cause errors in weighting. And 3. Ensure criteria authentically represent your rationale. Thank you, and please don't hesitate to ask whatever questions you may have.